George Washington, the father of his country, was born on February 22, 1732, in the British colony of Virginia. His early life may surprise you, as it was anything but the glamorous start you'd expect from someone who would go on to lead a revolution and become the first president of the United States. Washington grew up in a wealthy family that owned large plantations, and like many young boys of his time, he was homeschooled. However, he wasn't born into royalty or the type of privilege that came with a silver spoon. His father, Augustine Washington, was a successful planter and a key figure in the local community. But when George was only 11 years old, tragedy struck. His father died. This event forced Washington to grow up fast, taking on responsibilities beyond his years. Without his father, George couldn't receive the formal education his older brothers enjoyed. Instead, he focused on practical skills like surveying, which would later help him build a career. At the young age of 16, Washington became a surveyor for Lord Fairfax, traveling across rugged lands to map out the new frontiers of Virginia. This was where Washington's journey toward leadership truly began. While surveying may not sound glamorous, it taught him the importance of discipline, endurance, and decision-making, traits that would define him as a military leader and statesman. By the age of 20, Washington had also developed a strong interest in military affairs. His first taste of real action came in the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, a conflict between Britain and France that was fought on American soil. Washington served as a lieutenant colonel in the British colonial forces, leading men into battle and earning valuable experience in warfare. Though he faced many challenges, including a disastrous defeat at Fort Necessity, Washington's perseverance never wavered. Even in the face of failure, he learned crucial lessons about leadership, tactics, and diplomacy. His bravery during this period made him a regional hero, but more importantly, it opened his eyes to the British Empire's flaws. The British military and government's lack of respect for colonial officers like Washington planted the seeds of resentment that would later bloom into a full-blown revolution. But at this point, Washington was still loyal to the crown, though that would soon change. Washington's experiences in the French and Indian War, along with his deep connections to the Virginia aristocracy, paved the way for his political career. He was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1758, and his status as a planter and military officer made him a well-known figure. Washington married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow, in 1759, which further increased his standing in Virginia society. Together, they lived at Mount Vernon, the estate that would become Washington's lifelong home. However, by the 1760s, Washington's loyalty to Britain was being tested as tensions between the colonies and the British Empire began to rise. British taxation policies, including the infamous Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, enraged colonists. Washington, like many of his fellow Virginians, began to question British rule.
Don't forget to subscribe for more content. Click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell.
When we think of George Washington, we often picture him as the tall, stoic figure crossing the icy Delaware River during the Revolutionary War. But how did he get there? What made this humble Virginia planter the leader of an entire revolution? The answer lies in the growing unrest between the American colonies and the British government. By the early 1770s, British laws and taxes had reached a boiling point. Colonists felt oppressed by a distant monarchy that imposed taxes without giving them any real representation in Parliament. The famous cry of "no taxation without representation" echoed across the colonies, and soon resistance began to spread. Washington was no stranger to the political climate. He had become deeply involved in the Virginia legislature and was vocal about his opposition to British tyranny. But what really pushed him to the forefront was the First Continental Congress, a meeting of colonial leaders in 1774 to discuss their grievances against Britain. Washington attended as a delegate from Virginia, and it was here that his leadership qualities truly began to shine. By 1775, things had escalated. British troops clashed with colonial militias in Massachusetts at the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Revolutionary War had begun, and the colonies needed a leader to unite them. Despite having little formal military training, George Washington was chosen by the Continental Congress to command the newly formed Continental Army. It's important to note that Washington didn't become a legendary general overnight. The early years of the Revolutionary War were tough. The Continental Army was a ragtag group of poorly trained and poorly equipped soldiers, up against the most powerful military in the world. Washington faced numerous challenges: desertions, lack of supplies, and even mutinies. But he held his troops together with his charisma, determination, and unshakable belief in the cause of liberty. One of Washington's most famous moments came during the winter of 1776. His army was in dire straits, having suffered a series of defeats. Morale was low, and it seemed like the revolution might fail. But Washington knew that bold action was needed. On Christmas night, he led his troops across the icy Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on the British forces in Trenton, New Jersey. The victory was a turning point in the war, proving that the Continental Army could stand up to the British. Washington's ability to keep the army together was nothing short of remarkable. He endured terrible conditions, such as the brutal winter at Valley Forge in 1777–78. His soldiers faced starvation, disease, and bitter cold. But through it all, Washington remained a symbol of hope and resilience. He worked closely with foreign allies like France, which provided critical military and financial support that helped turn the tide of the war. The decisive moment came in 1781 at the Siege of Yorktown. Washington, with the help of French forces, trapped the British Army under General Cornwallis, forcing them to surrender. It was the final major battle of the Revolutionary War, and it secured American independence. After 8 long years of fighting, Washington had led the colonies to victory. But his greatest act of leadership was yet to come. Instead of seizing power for himself, as many feared he might, Washington resigned his commission and returned to civilian life. A move that stunned the world and cemented his legacy as a true servant of the people. With the war over and independence secured, America faced a new challenge: building a nation from scratch. While George Washington had hoped to retire to his beloved estate at Mount Vernon, the country had other plans for him. In 1787, Washington was called upon once again to provide leadership, this time at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The purpose of the convention was to draft a new framework for the government, as the Articles of Confederation, America's first attempt at government, had proven too weak. Washington was unanimously chosen to preside over the convention. His presence alone gave the meeting a sense of legitimacy and unity. While he didn't contribute much to the debates, his support for a strong federal government influenced the final document, the United States Constitution. Washington's steady hand and his reputation for selflessness and integrity made him the obvious choice to become the nation's first president when the Constitution was ratified. In 1789, Washington was unanimously elected as the first president of the United States, a title no one had held before. His role was not just to govern, but to set precedents for future presidents, creating the model for the American presidency. Washington approached this challenge with caution, knowing that every decision he made would shape the future of the new republic. One of the key decisions Washington made was forming a cabinet of advisors, including Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. This group would help guide him through difficult decisions, from economic policy to foreign relations. Washington, though a strong leader, was not a monarch. He believed in consultation and compromise, key traits that would define his leadership style. Another significant contribution Washington made during his presidency was establishing the principle of neutrality in foreign affairs. The young nation was caught between two warring giants, Britain and France, and many Americans wanted to side with one or the other. Washington, however, believed that the United States was too fragile to get entangled in European conflicts. His Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 set the tone for American foreign policy for decades to come, keeping the nation out of wars that could have threatened its survival. Washington's presidency was not without challenges. Political parties began to form during his time in office. Jefferson leading the Democratic Republicans and Hamilton leading the Federalists. Washington was deeply troubled by this development, fearing that factions would divide the nation. In his famous farewell address in 1796, Washington warned the country against the dangers of political parties. He also warned against entangling alliances with foreign nations. His words of caution still resonate today, showing his deep understanding of the complexities of governing a diverse and often divided nation. In 1797, after 2 terms as president, Washington did something unprecedented. He voluntarily stepped down. This peaceful transfer of power was a remarkable event in a world where leaders often clung to power indefinitely. By doing so, Washington solidified the idea that the presidency was not a lifetime position and set a powerful precedent for the future. He returned to Mount Vernon, finally ready to enjoy the quiet life he had long desired. Washington's legacy extends far beyond his military and presidential achievements. He is often remembered as the indispensable man, the one person who could unite a fledgling nation and guide it through its most vulnerable years. His leadership was marked by humility, restraint, and an unwavering commitment to the principles of liberty and democracy. Even today, his example continues to inspire generations of Americans.